Welcome back to the Real Regan.
I remember my dad would be driving me along the Pacific Coast Highway going out to the ranch, and he'd be talking to me, and he was saying, Michael, he says, I'd love to give you some more allowance. I'd love to, but I just can't afford it. And I'm thinking to myself, right, I'm living in this big mansion in Beverly Hills. You've got a nice dig yourself. You're sitting in a nice new car. And he would explain to me, he says, the government takes 90% of what I make. And I'm thinking to myself, boy, that's a lot of money. And so he started explaining to me, I get $1, the government gets 90 cents, I get 10 cents out of every dollar. And I said, that's stupid. And my dad would say, yeah, that is kind of idiotic. He says, wouldn't you think that someday this country would elect a president who would just absolutely slash the tax system and give people more of their own hard-earned money? He says, I could vote for a guy like that. And I'd say, yeah, Dad, so could I. He says, but you're not old enough. And I said, someday I will be. I mean, little did you know that, 13 years later, that this would be the man who would go to Washington, D.C. to slash the tax system so that we could have more of our money. And he used to talk to me about that driving out to the ranch when I was 8 years old.
I believe that when something is taxed, you get less of it. That's just common sense. We're taxing work, savings, and investment as never before. So we have less work, less savings, and less investment. I didn't agree with President Kennedy on most things, but when he cut taxes, everyone gained from an expanding, fully employed economy, even the government. If I'm elected, we'll do it again.
The time is now for strong leadership. Reagan for president.
General Haig, we've heard a lot of talk about the president's stories. He was also somebody, at least in press accounts, who, when there would be a big meeting of cabinet or other folks, would sit around and tell stories. Did that drive you guys nuts?
Not me. Let me say something. You're probably wondering what I'm doing here. I only worked for President Reagan for about 18 months. So I've got some good news and some bad news for you. Bad news is I'm not someone that knows Ronald Reagan the way everyone else at this group does. But secondly, I'm somewhat of an expert on the last job he held, because I've served 7 presidents in my lifetime, 4 at intimately close range. I had one president, very recent one, worked for me twice. And in addition to that, I myself have been president twice. Some of you may forget, the first time was doing Watergate, almost 18 months, and the second was that all too brief a period the day Ronald Reagan was shot. Now, having said that, I can attest to the president's good humor and affability. The first airplane ride I was on with him, it was a very tight little airplane, and as we got off the plane, he bumped his head. And you'll remember President Jerry Ford, God bless him, was accused of not being able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And here was a man who was probably the greatest athlete we ever had in the White House, but the Fourth Estate created a stumble bump. So as the president walked out, he bumped his head. He said, see, Al, I told you I could be president.
Budget meeting taking place in the cabinet room, discussing some detail of tax, this or that. And there was an item the president wanted. And the congressional liaison was going through the briefing and said, Mr. President, I'm sorry, it's too late. I've spoken to Senator Dole, and the horse has already left the barn on that one. President, the horse has left the barn? Yes, it's just too late, I'm sorry. And he moved on with his briefing. The president seemed to sort of step out of the conversation for a moment, and then suddenly he just stood up, left the cabinet room, and disappeared into the Oval Office, leaving people looking at each other. A moment later, he came back. I've just spoken to Senator Dole. The horse is back in the barn.
AC, by the way, you need to know that AC is one of 2 people alive today who is at liberty to refer to Mr. Reagan as Ronnie.
You know, I tell you, I always have called him Ronnie for all these 62 years I've known him, except in the Oval Office. I never could call him Ronnie in the Oval Office, and I made the mistake of doing it once, and I said, I'm sorry that I did this, but if the staff was around or something, I would always say, Ronnie, but when he was sworn in as president, we were waiting at the White House, about 20 of us, for him to make his entrance into the White House. And he and Nancy came in, and they played the Hail to the Chief, and they announced President Ronald Reagan and Mrs. Reagan after they had played Hail to the Chief. And Ronnie came over to me first and leaned down and he said, you know, when I heard Hail to the Chief, I thought Iron Eyes Cody was coming in the room.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates and inflation down, more people are buying new homes, and our new families can have confidence in the future. America today is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
And we're back with the men and women who knew Ronald Reagan best.
The East Coast Press, of which I was then a happy and proud member, really lowballed his expectations. At that point, I was offered my choice of candidates to cover, and I said, well, I'm going to take Reagan because of a variety of reasons. I want more time in California, and he's not going to make as many stops as the other guys. He'll have an easier schedule. But in the back of my mind, I said, well, he'll make it into the finals for the Republican nomination. Probably won't get much further than that, and I won't have to do the whole bloody campaign, which I really wasn't in the mood to do. Between Iowa and New Hampshire of that year, and there was a bigger spread then, he took a bit of a beating in Iowa, had to come back in New Hampshire, and I sensed that he was doing that, and I told my colleagues back in New York at the magazine that you guys better prepare yourselves. This old guy who used to sell Baraxo on television is probably going to win New Hampshire, and if he wins New Hampshire, et cetera, et cetera. The request came back, let us do an essay on why the Republican Party is too smart to nominate Ronald Reagan. After all, they said they nominated a ideological right-winger back in '64. Look what happened, the terrible debacle. Those of us in the field who were covering the campaign, covering the different candidates, luckily we reached a consensus and simultaneously from our separate spots wired back to New York saying, forget about it. That essay will embarrass you for the rest of the century. They swallowed the essay, he won New Hampshire, and I got stuck with covering the whole campaign. But, as well as the Reagan years in the White House, but that's another story. But the point is that there was a much bigger schism then between the East Coast and the West Coast. And the East Coast, capital of most of the media organizations, really couldn't get him because they hadn't been out. I had the same problem until I spent a number of months following him around.
I mean, I think for me, the classic story of what everybody was talking about with Reagan being underestimated, it came from my old friend Bob Strauss, who he likes to tell this on himself. And I hope I can get through this for television. But he said that the night that Ronald Reagan and George Bush were nominated in Detroit, that the president then, President Carter and Jody maybe and a couple of his staff got a hold of Bob in Houston. It was about 11 o'clock at night or 12 o'clock at night at Houston and said, Bob, we were just sitting around here watching the Republican convention and we've just seen what's happened and we want to know what you think about it. And Bob said, well, I'll tell you what I think, Mr. President. I think the Republicans just nominated only 2 SOBs in America you can beat.
As a follow-on to that, the first debate, or the debate with Carter, which took place in Cleveland, we were apparently many of us in the same hotel, and I ran into Jody Powell and Hamilton Jordan that morning in the hotel. I never met these guys before, but we knew each other. And I think it was Jody Powell said, we're going to kill your guy tonight. And I said, really? How are you going to do that? We're going to kill him with facts. And I said, really? Gee, that's scary. And yep. And so they were supremely confident. We shook hands and walked away. And I later saw the governor, and I said, they're going to kill you tonight. And he said, well, what are they going to do that with? I said, facts. He said, well, we'll see. Of course, that was the night that President Carter informed the nation that he was taking his advice on nuclear weapons from Amy, and Ronald Reagan said, there he goes again.
General Haig, I mean, people forget what the kind of place the world was. 1979, 1980. That may have been the last election in which foreign policy played a pivotal role. Talk a little bit about the time.
Well, I think foreign policy at that time was a centerpiece, as it had been all through the 70s, because the Cold War was beginning somewhat more brittle. And I think the one side was in an advanced state of decay, and thanks to Ronald Reagan, that was expedited. So foreign policy is what grabbed the attention of the American people. That's not true today. But I remember President Nixon saying to me, the domestic side, especially the economy, can run itself, and the more you keep your fingers off it, the better in a free market.
Was that before he put in wage and price?
No, that's before he listened to John Connally. Before he listened to John Connally. But having said that, Lan, you'll remember it was John Connally who talked him into it, and the second time around who talked him out of it was me.
And I remember
So
John
I don't
Connally
feel
got
too
one
shy
delegate,
about
too.
that subject. But having said that,
We've just
I
had the
think-
third term of Alexander Haig.
you know, the other thing that same president said, and it wasn't so far off the mark, was that what really matters in the nuclear age is war and peace. And when we put a man in that Oval Office, his ability to deal with those issues is the most fundamental criteria for selection that we can have.
That may be, but in the first year or so, the new president spent much more time on domestic policy and studiously avoided, much to your heartburn, as I recall, a lot of involvement on his part in, say, dealing with the Soviets.
Well, he had huge economic
But
issues.
there was a reason for that.
He knew
Well,
he had
that's
a
all right,
great
but
There
Secretary
was
of
a
State.
specific reason,
He
and it
got
was part
more
of his
jollies and was
part of
more
a specific strategy.
He was more concerned about cutting taxes,
Yes.
attempting to cut the budget,
Yes.
and that's where a great deal of his energy
you
was.
forget
Don't
the first-
misunderstand it. I loved it because I could do pretty well what I wanted in those areas.
And that was just the problem.
The only restraint I had was the mouth that's about to move now.
If I could, go ahead.
He was talking about you or me? You have to remember the first press conference, and where the president said that the Soviets would lie, cheat, and steal to get whatever they want. And Al and I were standing to the side, the press, Larry Barrett included, and the other Eastern press there, all shocked. They were in a state of shock. And immediately afterwards, the president walked out, and I think Al stayed around to chat with the press, or maybe leaked to them. I doubt that, though. And
I left that to the experts, Mike.
That's Richard, I'm Mike.
I followed the president. I didn't finish the story. I followed the president back. I was walking behind him, and as he walked down the colonnade to the Oval Office, he knew I was walking behind him, and he stopped, and he turned around, and he said, "Say, Dick." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "The Soviets, they do lie, cheat, and steal, don't they, to get what they want?" I said, "Yes, sir, they do." And he said, "I thought so."
Welcome back to the Real Regan.
The night of the first inaugural, back in 1981, my wife Colleen and I were lucky enough to be at the very first ball that he would go to at the Hilton that night, and to first introduce him as the President of the United States. And so we all went into the holding room there at the Hilton, and we were there waiting for Dad and Nancy to come, and finally Nancy and Dad come in, and Nancy's talking to Colleen, who's here, and I'm here, and Dad's turned, and there's a mirror on the back wall, and he's in his white white tie and tails, and I'm kind of looking past Nancy at Dad and looking in the mirror of him looking at himself, and he kind of cocks his head to one side, and then he turns straight around to all of us, and he jumps straight up in the air, clicks his heels together, he says, "I'm the President of the United States of America."
One of the things that any president has to do is to establish his seriousness, and maybe the signal event early on was firing the air traffic controllers, the PATCO strike. Mike Deaver, why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I remember when the cabinet all gathered in the cabinet room to discuss what we were going to do, and it went on for half an hour, 45 minutes, and Drew Lewis and everybody were making suggestions and sort of arguing back and forth across the table, and all of a sudden I looked over and realized that the president wasn't paying any attention to any of this discussion that was going on. He was working on this yellow pad, and finally, after about 45 minutes, he raised his hand and he said, "Fellows, just a minute, please. Let me just read you this." And it was a statement that we gave 15 minutes later in the Rose Garden, where he fired the air traffic controllers. He hadn't paid any attention to, as opposed to what the press and others would like to paint this picture of him, who never could have an original thought of his own, that the staff drove him. Was simply erroneous. And back to this business about what Larry was talking about, I love to hear Larry and the media talk about these stories about poor old Ronald Reagan. The wonderful thing about him is that it never bothered him a bit what these guys thought.
Sheila, one of the things that people talk about is a sense of humor. In fact, it sounds almost as if after the shooting, that was in March of 1981, there was almost like a joke fest.
I still remember standing in the hallway at GW Hospital, and here is Mike Deaver, Jim Baker, and Ed Meese standing, and they were all looking down like this as he comes by. I can still see their necks down like this, and his head, he strained up like this, and he looked at him and said, "Who's minding the store?" And this place was crammed with doctors. I mean, I don't know why there had to be 75 doctors lining the hallway at GW, but they were. They were all in their green operating outfits. And this wave of laughter just raced up and down that hall, and you could just feel the tension melt away.
I think Margaret Thatcher got the entry line pretty right when she said Ronald Reagan won the Cold War without firing a shot.
Welcome back to the Real Regan.
I wouldn't want the audience to get the impression that foreign policy wasn't very high on the president's agenda from the first moment he was in the White House. If you recall, he entered the White House in the midst of the Iranian hostage crisis.
Oh, did.
And I had watched that as a member of the previous administration and our commander in NATO. I was appalled at the way the United States dealt with that situation. And I discussed it with the president in the early hours. And I said, I think we should get very, very tough on Iran, and we must get these people out. He said, Al, you're behind me. He said, I want you to be not only very tough, but very much tougher than the previous administration. And that was the first communication we had with the Iranians, that they'd better let those people out. And the minute that man was inaugurated, they were released.
I mean, Peter Robinson, this is such a natural cue to you. Talk about the behind-the-scenes jostling before Mr. Gorbachev tear down that wall.
I got the typical direction that a speechwriter would get before writing a speech. The president's going to be positioned here in front of the Berlin Wall, Brandenburg Gate behind him, 10,000 people out here. He'll speak for 35 minutes. The subject is foreign policy. And I went to Berlin with the Secret Service, the pre-advance team, and got briefed by our diplomats on the ground. And the diplomats said, look, Reagan, Berlin is a very sophisticated city. Universities here. It's the leftmost politically of all the cities in Germany, don't have him look like a cowboy. Don't have him do any Soviet bashing. And then they gave me a list of diplomatic initiatives they wanted the president to mention. More overflight rights into Berlin. Maybe we'd support their bid to host the Olympics one year. My heart was sinking. I was picturing Ronald Reagan standing, dramatic moment, saying, and we will press for more overflight rights. And that evening, I broke away from the American group, a fellow who was German and who had worked at the bank here in Washington and had retired back to his hometown of Germany. I hadn't met him, but he knew of me through mutual friends. He put on a dinner party, so that he and his wife, so that I could meet some Berliners. It became clear that these people hated that wall every day of their lives. And then the hostess, lovely woman, she must have been in her early 60s, but she became very angry. And she said, if this man Gorbachev means anything by this perestroika and this glasnost, he can prove it by coming here and getting rid of that wall. And I knew I had something for Ronald Reagan.
And that's when you wrote Something There Is Doesn't Like a Wall?
That's it. In any event, I went back and drafted the speech, went to the president, then we went in and had a meeting with the president, and it was a typical Ronald Reagan meeting in the sense that everything was very gentle. Mr. President said, Tom Griscom, the Director of Communications, is there anything particular? Well, no, I thought that draft was fine. And then I had a question I wanted to ask him. I said, Mr. President, depending on weather conditions, the speech will be picked up by radio on the other side of the wall and possibly as far east as Moscow. Is there anything in particular you'd like to say to people on the other side of the Iron Curtain? And the president thought and said, well, that passage about the wall, that wall has to come down, and that's what I'd like to say to them. That was all. Simple as that. And then for 3 weeks, there was fighting about it. The National Security Council wanted it out. The State Department wanted it out. I got yanked into meeting after meeting after meeting. It's naive. It's unfair to raise German hopes that the wall will actually come down when we know that it won't come down. On and on it went. The Director of Communications, Tommy Griscom, young fellow, younger than I am now, had a problem. Somebody was going to have to go to the President of the United States and say, you know, Mr. President, that line about tearing down the wall that you really liked, well, the State Department thinks that wouldn't be such a good idea.
I wasn't there.
And so Tommy Griscom couldn't quite see himself playing this scene opposite Ronald Reagan. The last event, the very morning the speech was to be given, as I recall, it was the 7th alternate draft that got submitted, and it got submitted by telefax to Air Force One as the plane was going into Berlin. And the president, that was that. And he got up and delivered that speech. And that speech could only have been delivered by Ronald Reagan. I worked for other politicians. I wouldn't have written it for other politicians. If I'd written it for other politicians, they would never have delivered it. He and he alone made that line possible.
I think Margaret Thatcher got the entry line pretty right when she said Ronald Reagan won the Cold War without firing a shot.
It was 1979. We were flying from Houston to Los Angeles, and it was a long flight, headwind, and he was working on the announcement speech. We got into a conversation about various things, and I said, what really is the difference between you and Carter on television? I have a different view of you. He said, well, you know, he said, when you hear President Carter speaking, you feel as though you're down in a plaza with about 10,000 people, and he's up high and he's talking to you and he's talking at you. And when I talk, I look at the camera and I treat it as my friend. I think of it as my friend, and therefore I think people have a different view. And I think that's absolutely true. It was true all his years as president.
As long as we're telling camera stories, there are two of my favorites. One was when he was first elected governor, and I think it was either Time or NBC was going to come out and do a day in the life of Ronald Reagan. And for me, I was 30 years old, 29, something like that. This was really the big time, you know, we were going to get into it. And so I worked and put together a whole storyboard on butcher paper that had every minute of the day figured out for him, and I took it in and laid it on his desk. And the first thing, he looked at it and he said, well, now what's that? I said, well, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take your jacket off and sling it over your shoulder, and we're going to go out into the state capitol grounds, and you'll look very pensive. It'll be very Kennedy-esque. And he said, well, I can't do that. And I said, what do you mean you can't do that? He said, well, Mike, you've got to understand that I wouldn't be comfortable doing that. And if I'm not comfortable doing that, the people watching it are not going to be comfortable. He said, you have to understand you can't fool the camera. The camera doesn't lie. And I thought, I've never forgotten that, but I always thought, what a great instinct for somebody who was going to go into public office to know that he couldn't fool the camera.
He might have given a speech 15 times, but he would also stop and have that same conversation with one person in private.
When you need news fast, we have it first. Fox News Channel.
And we're back with the men and women who knew Ronald Reagan best.
All of us have been giving a lot of accolades to a wonderful man, my friend Ronald Reagan, as president and governor. But I have to tell you, I think probably the most important thing that ever happened to Ronald Reagan was meeting Nancy. Nancy has been at his side, and as Mike said, it was always with Ronnie we, and that included Nancy. And from the day they met, Nancy was under contract at MGM, and she had a little problem that she thought the Screen Actors Guild should take care of. And she was working with a wonderful director, Mervyn LeRoy, and Mervyn said, why don't you call the Guild and get this straightened out? And she said, well, who would I talk to? He said, talk to the president of the Guild, Ronald Reagan. She said, I don't know him. He said, I know, and I'll call him. And he called Ronnie out at Warner's and said, there's a lady here that you should talk to. She has a problem about the Guild. They got on the phone, and Ronnie says, look, I can see you after work, but only for about 15 minutes because I have an early call tomorrow morning. And she said, well, I have an early call too. So they met for a drink, and Ronnie took one look at this wonderful lady and just fell in love instantly. And evidently she looked at him and fell in love instantly too. They said, incidentally, he said, I lied to you. I don't have to be at the studio until 11 o'clock tomorrow. And she said, I lied to you too because I'm off tomorrow.
Mike Deaver, it's often been said that Ronald Reagan has one true intimate, and it's Nancy Reagan. Is that true?
Yep. It is true. And you know, we have all been talking about this great man tonight, but this is Nancy's finest hour.
Absolutely.
He's taking care of him day and night. And the people that have criticized her ought to stop and think for a minute about what she's had to go through now for this, as Mike knows, greatest love of all time, these two people.
Of all politicians, this man has incredible passion about what he's talking about, and knows what he's talking about, and knows his audience.
Ronald Reagan once noted that history has one-sentence entries when it talks about presidents. What's the one-sentence entry for Ronald Reagan?
Reagan looked on this country as a shining city on a hill, and he looked at it as a beacon of freedom to the rest of the world. And one of the things that he did is he really extended freedom to much of the world. Do you know, under Ronald Reagan, for the first time since World War II, there was no advance of communism. And he had this great optimism and great belief in the American people. He believed there was nothing the American people couldn't do if they put their minds to it. And it was that kind of optimism and that kind of an approach that I think the American people sensed and loved.
I think we can argue all night long, but one of my favorite descriptions is what made him a leader and why we still talk about him today. And that's because there was nobody in the world he'd rather be. He didn't have to be anybody else except who he was. He was comfortable.
He was the genuine article. You know, there was nothing phony about Ronald Reagan. He might have given a speech 15 times, but he would also stop and have that same conversation with one person in private, and it would be exactly the same. Sure. I think if I were writing that one line, it would be that he changed the way people look at government, think about government.
Why is it that today Ronald Reagan still incites such passion?
Oh, he was and is a polarizing figure. His own pollster said that. He was a man of strong feelings. He stated those feelings in a strong fashion, and he brought out both a lot of admiration from those who agreed with him and some very strong disagreement from those who disagreed with him.
He was us. He was you. He was me. He wasn't above us. He wasn't below us. He made us feel like we were part of him and that he was part of us. He treated me the same way he treated you. He didn't treat people differently. He could talk to Mikhail Gorbachev one day and the blind child another day and give him the same amount of time, the same amount of caring, same amount of love.
That's not a man who polarized. I think that's an inept description of Ronald Reagan. He gave more a sense of togetherness. He, of course, angered some by his policy positions, but on a personal level, he antagonized no one. And you can tell that the welling sentiment and the reevaluations that are now taking place in the Reagan presidency are looking deeper into that president who was determined, dedicated, and courageous and stayed the course.
It was morning in America.
Right.
Dick, I think more than anyone else I know, he brought patriotism back to this country. And he made it. And he made us all feel proud to be Americans.
Yeah, you can see that build, as a matter of fact, in 1979. 79 turned into 80, as the crowds of people would line. You'd go into town, you'd drive in an airport, you'd drive into town. And suddenly, as the campaign kept going, the lines of people from the outskirts of town to the airport became longer and deeper. And people suddenly started carrying American flags. And it was rather astounding to see, particularly having covered the Carter administration, nothing against President Carter, but the showing of American flags out in public wasn't that common, and maybe
How about
that's
the
a little
wearing of
symbolic.
uniforms?
Pardon me?
The order went out the day before the inauguration that the staff, the military staff, should feel free to and be encouraged to wear its uniforms around the White House. That wasn't popular before.
Ronald Reagan's values were as simple and American and unchanging as that flat landscape in the Midwest where he grew up. And he took those values and applied them to the great problems of our time, and in so doing became the largest and in some ways the most magnificent figure of the second half of the 20th century in American history.
Nice report. Well, on January 20th, 1989, Ronald Reagan became only the second president in nearly 160 years to be able to see his own vice president sworn in as President of the United States. Even now, as you can see, passions run high about the 40th President of the United States. I want to thank our panel, everybody who's put this program together, and you, the audience, for giving the rest of America a glimpse of the real Reagan.